It was a cold October evening when my older brother, Alex, decided to take his motorcycle out for a quick ride. Alex loved his bike more than anything, an old Harley Davidson he'd spent months customizing. I always worried about him riding it, especially after dark, but he shrugged off my concerns, calling me paranoid. "I'll just take it down the highway and back," he said, grabbing his helmet. "Be back in 20 minutes. I nodded reluctantly, watching him roar off into the night. The sound of the engine echoed through the neighborhood until it faded away. 20 minutes passed, then 30, then an hour. I started calling his phone, but it went straight to voicemail. A sinking feeling crept into my stomach. Something was wrong. By the time 2 hours had passed, I decided to call the police. They asked me for details about the bike, his route, and what he was wearing. Then they told me to wait. The next few hours were agonizing. Every time the phone rang, I jumped, praying it was Alex calling to say he'd just had a flat tire or got caught up somewhere. But deep down, I knew it wasn't going to be that simple. Around midnight, I got the call. A deputy from the sheriff's department informed me that Alex had been involved in a motorcycle accident on a stretch of highway about 15 miles from our house. My heart sank. "Is he okay?" I stammered. "He was taken to St. Mary's Hospital," the deputy said. "That's all we know right now." I grabbed my keys and sped to the hospital. When I arrived, I found Alex in the ICU. His face was bruised, his arm was in a cast, and his left leg was in a sling. But he was alive, barely conscious, and muttering something I couldn't quite make out. I asked the nurse what happened. She hesitated before explaining that Alex had been found lying on the side of the highway, thrown from his bike after a collision. They couldn't say for sure what caused the crash, but no other vehicles had been involved. That struck me as odd. Alex was an experienced rider. He wouldn't just lose control of his bike for no reason. When Alex finally woke up the next morning, he was disoriented and in pain. But he managed to tell me what happened. His voice was shaky, and he kept glancing toward the door as if he was afraid someone, or something, might walk in. "I was riding down the highway," he began, "just cruising, no cars around, when I saw this guy standing on the shoulder. He was waving his arms like he was trying to flag me down. I slowed down, thinking maybe he needed help, but as I got closer, I realized something was off about him." "What do you mean?" I asked. "He was wearing this old, dirty suit, like something out of the 1940s, Alex said, his eyes wide. "And his face, it didn't look right. Pale, sunken eyes, like he hadn't slept in years." Alex paused, swallowing hard. I was going to stop, but then he stepped onto the road right in front of me. I swerved to avoid him, but I lost control and went down. When I looked up, he was gone. Just gone. Chills ran down my spine. "Are you sure?" I asked. Alex nodded. "I know what I saw." Over the next few days, as Alex recovered, I decided to do some digging. I looked up accidents on that stretch of highway and found something eerie. The spot where Alex crashed had a history of strange incidents, car wrecks, motorcycle crashes, even reports of people swerving to avoid phantom pedestrians. One article from 1987 mentioned a man named Edward Grayson, who was killed in a hit-and-run accident while changing a tire on that exact stretch of road. Witnesses described him as wearing a gray suit, the same kind Alex had described. I showed the article to Alex, and his face went pale. "That's him," he whispered. "That's the guy I saw." We decided to visit the crash site together once Alex was well enough. When we got there, the air felt heavy, and the only sound was the distant hum of cars passing by. We found the spot where Alex had crashed, marked by a skid on the asphalt and a broken guardrail, and placed some flowers there, just in case. As we stood there, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. Alex must have felt it too, because he suddenly turned around, scanning the empty highway. "Let's go," he said quickly. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I pictured the man in the suit, standing on the side of the road. I started wondering if he was still out there, waiting for his next victim. Alex sold his Harley a few months later. He said it was because he needed the money, but I think it was more than that. He never rode again. To this day, I avoid that stretch of highway, especially at night. I don't know if Alex really saw a ghost that night, or if it was just his mind playing tricks on him after the crash. But I do know one thing. Whatever happened on that road wasn't normal, and I hope I never have to experience anything like it. It was a warm summer evening in late July when my friend Nate convinced me to go on a motorcycle ride. I didn't have much experience riding, but Nate, a seasoned motorcyclist, had recently bought a second bike, a sleek black Yamaha, and was eager to take it for a spin. "Come on, Alex," he said, tossing me a helmet. "It'll be fun. The highway's pretty quiet this time of night, and we'll stick to back roads after that. Just follow my lead." Reluctantly, I agreed. We set out just as the sun was beginning to dip below the horizon, the sky a blend of deep oranges and purples. The air was warm, and for the first hour, everything was perfect. We cruised down empty highways, the wind rushing past us, and I started to understand why Nate loved riding so much. Eventually, Nate veered off the highway onto a winding country road I didn't recognize. The scenery changed almost instantly. The vibrant glow of the sunset faded, replaced by dense trees that lined both sides of the road. There were no streetlights, and the further we went, the darker it got. "Where are we going?" I shouted over the roar of the engines. "You'll see," Nate yelled back, his voice barely audible. The road twisted and turned, each curve sharper than the last. I had to focus hard to keep up with Nate, who seemed to navigate the bends effortlessly. After what felt like an eternity, he slowed down and pulled over to the side of the road. I parked behind him, pulling off my helmet. "What's the deal?" I asked, slightly annoyed. Nate grinned, pointing ahead. "This road's got a story. Locals call it Devil's Bend. They say it's haunted." I rolled my eyes. "Seriously? You brought me out here for some ghost story?" "Just hear me out," he said, his tone shifting to something more serious. "Back in the 70s, a biker named Rick Turner crashed here. The guy was a notorious daredevil, always pushing his limits. One night, he was riding this very stretch when he miscalculated a turn and went straight into a tree. Died on impact." "That's tragic," I said, unsure where he was going with this. "Here's the creepy part," Nate continued. "People say his ghost still haunts this road. Riders claim they've seen a headlight in their mirrors, like another bike following them. But when they stop to look, there's no one there." I laughed nervously. "Yeah, right. Sounds like a campfire tale to me." Nate shrugged, putting his helmet back on. "Believe what you want, but I've heard enough stories to know there's something weird about this place. Come on, let's keep going." Reluctantly, I followed him back onto the road. The story stuck in my mind, and I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that we weren't alone. The road seemed darker now, the trees looming closer. Every shadow felt menacing, and the hum of the engine did little to drown out my growing anxiety. About 10 minutes later, I noticed something strange. A light appeared in my side mirror, a single faint headlight. Another rider, I thought, glancing back over my shoulder, but the road was empty. I shook my head, trying to dismiss it as a trick of the light, but when I looked back at the mirror, the headlight was still there. This time it was closer. "Nate!" I shouted, but he didn't hear me. He was too far ahead, his focus locked on the road. The light behind me grew brighter, and a chill ran down my spine. I glanced over my shoulder again, but there was still no one there. Just the empty road and the faint outline of trees in the distance. Suddenly, the headlight disappeared. I let out a shaky breath, telling myself it was just my imagination, but my hands trembled as I gripped the handlebars. I pushed the bike to catch up with Nate, my heart pounding. When I finally reached him, he had pulled over again, this time near an old wooden bridge. "What's wrong?" he asked, noticing the look on my face. I think I saw something," I stammered. Nate's expression darkened. "The headlight?" I nodded, swallowing hard. "I told you," he said quietly. "This place is messed up." We stood there for a moment in silence, the only sounds coming from the distant chirping of crickets and the occasional rustle of leaves. The air felt heavy, like we were being watched. "Let's get out of here," I said finally. Nate agreed, and we mounted our bikes. He took the lead again, but this time I stayed closer. As we crossed the bridge, something felt off. The wooden planks creaked under the weight of our bikes, and the air grew colder. Halfway across, I saw something that made my blood run cold. A figure stood at the edge of the bridge, a man wearing a leather jacket and a helmet, his face obscured by the shadows. "Nate, stop!" I shouted, but he kept going, seemingly unaware of the figure. The man didn't move as I approached, and for a moment I thought I was imagining him. But as I passed, his head turned to follow me. I froze, the bike wobbling slightly. When I looked back, he was gone. Panic set in, and I gunned the throttle, catching up to Nate as fast as I could. "Did you see him?" I yelled, pulling up alongside him. "See who?" Nate asked, confused. "The guy on the bridge." He shook his head. "There was no one there, Alex." I didn't argue. I just wanted to get as far away from that place as possible. We rode in silence for the next few miles, neither of us daring to stop. The uneasy feeling lingered, and every shadow seemed to shift and move. Just when I thought we were in the clear, the headlight appeared again. This time it wasn't in my mirror. It was directly behind Nate. "Nate!" I screamed, pointing behind him. He glanced back and immediately swerved, nearly losing control of his bike. "What the hell?" he shouted, but when he looked again, the light was gone. We didn't stop until we reached the main highway, the safety of streetlights washing over us. Nate pulled over, ripping off his helmet. "What was that?" he demanded, his face pale. "I don't know," I admitted, my voice trembling. We sat there for a while, trying to make sense of what had happened. Neither of us had a logical explanation, but we both knew one thing. Something was on that road with us. That was the last time either of us rode near Devil's Bend. Nate eventually sold both his bikes, and I haven't been on a motorcycle since. Sometimes, late at night, I think about the man on the bridge and the phantom headlight. I wonder if Rick Turner is still out there, haunting that lonely stretch of road, looking for his next victim. I hope I never find out. It was a crisp fall evening when my friend Derek called me with an idea. "Hey man," he said excitedly, "I just got my Harley out of the shop, and I found this route in the woods that's supposed to be a biker's dream. You in?" I hesitated. Night rides weren't exactly my thing, especially on unfamiliar roads, but Derek was persistent. "Come on, it's supposed to be an incredible ride. Twisties, great views, and barely any traffic," he added. Reluctantly, I agreed. By the time we met at the gas station, the sun had already dipped below the horizon, and the air was colder than I'd expected. Derek was grinning from ear to ear as he revved his Harley. "Let's go," he shouted over the engine's roar. The first stretch of the ride was uneventful. We cruised through quiet suburban streets and onto a long, deserted highway. The streetlights eventually gave way to darkness as we reached the wooded area Derek had mentioned. The road narrowed, twisting and turning with sharp curves that required all of my focus. Tall trees loomed over us, their branches forming a canopy that blocked out what little moonlight there was. About 10 minutes in, Derek slowed down and pointed to a small, rusted sign on the side of the road. It was barely visible, but it read, Cedar Creek Road. "This is it," he said. "They say this road is haunted. Perfect for a spooky ride, right?" He laughed, but something about the way his voice wavered told me he wasn't entirely joking. "Haunted?" I asked, rolling my eyes. "Come on, man, let's just ride." He smirked, kicking his bike into gear, and we headed down the narrow path. Cedar Creek Road was different from any road I'd ever been on. The pavement was cracked and uneven, with weeds sprouting through the gaps. The trees seemed closer here, their gnarled branches reaching out like skeletal hands. The air was heavy, almost suffocating, and I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. Derek, as usual, was fearless, speeding ahead and taking the sharp curves like a pro. I struggled to keep up, my anxiety growing with every mile. Suddenly, he slowed down and pulled over to the side of the road. "What's up?" I asked, pulling up next to him. He pointed to a small clearing ahead. "There's a bridge up there. It's called Devil's Crossing. They say a biker died there years ago. Lost control, went over the edge, and landed in the creek below. People claim his ghost haunts this road." I laughed nervously. "You really believe that stuff?" Derek shrugged. "I don't know, but they say if you stop on the bridge and turn off your engine, you can hear his bike revving in the distance." "Sounds like a load of crap," I said, though the uneasiness in my voice betrayed me. "Let's find out," Derek said, grinning as he revved his engine and took off toward the bridge. I followed reluctantly, my heart pounding as the narrow road opened up into a clearing. The bridge was old and rickety, its wooden planks creaking under the weight of our bikes as we rode onto it. Derek stopped in the middle and turned off his engine, motioning for me to do the same. The silence was deafening. All I could hear was the faint rustling of leaves and the distant chirping of crickets. Derek leaned back, his arms crossed as he stared into the darkness. And then we heard it. At first it was faint, barely audible over the sounds of the forest. But as we listened, the noise grew louder. It was the unmistakable sound of a motorcycle engine, its deep, guttural roar echoing through the trees. I looked at Derek, expecting him to laugh and admit it was a prank, but his face was pale, his eyes wide with fear. "Do you hear that?" he whispered. I nodded, my throat dry. "Where's it coming from?" The sound grew closer, and I instinctively turned to look down the road. In the distance, a single headlight appeared, bobbing and weaving as it made its way toward us. My stomach dropped. "Who else would be out here this late?" I muttered. Derek shook his head. "No one. This road's closed off past the bridge." The headlight grew brighter and the roar of the engine was deafening now, but something about it was off. It didn't sound like a modern bike. It was older, rougher, almost like the sputtering of an ancient engine struggling to stay alive. "Let's go," I said, panic rising in my chest, but before I could start my bike, the headlight disappeared. The engine noise cut off abruptly, leaving us in an eerie silence. Derek and I sat there, frozen. "What the hell was that?" he whispered. Before I could respond, the sound returned, this time from the opposite direction. I whipped my head around, but there was nothing there. Just darkness. The wooden planks beneath us began to vibrate, as if something heavy was moving across the bridge. Derek and I exchanged terrified glances before starting our bikes. He peeled out, and I followed close behind, my hands trembling as I gripped the handlebars. We rode in silence, the only sound coming from our engines. The road seemed to stretch on forever, the dense trees pressing in from both sides. I kept glancing in my mirrors, half expecting to see that headlight behind us. Just when I thought we were in the clear, Derek suddenly slammed on his brakes. I skidded to a stop beside him, my heart racing. "What now?" I asked. He pointed ahead, his hand shaking. There, in the middle of the road, stood a man. He was wearing a leather jacket and jeans, his face obscured by the shadows. In his hand, he held a motorcycle helmet. "Is that—" I started, but Derek cut me off. "Don't stop. Just go," he shouted, revving his engine and speeding past the figure. I followed without hesitation, my eyes locked on the road ahead. I didn't dare look back. We didn't stop until we reached the main highway, the bright lights of civilization washing over us like a wave of relief. Derek pulled over, and I did the same, both of us panting as if we'd just run a marathon. What was that?" I asked, my voice trembling. Derek shook his head, his face pale. "I don't know, but I'm never riding Cedar Creek Road again." Neither of us spoke much on the ride home. The experience left a scar that neither time nor distance could erase. To this day, I still hear the phantom engine in my dreams, and I can't help but wonder if we encountered the ghost of Devil's Crossing, or if something far worse was out there that night.